Good morning, everybody. Just 8 weeks ago, we had the mini-budget that was unceremoniously unpicked within days. Today, the man who did that will set out his plan for how to plug the financial black hole. The Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, is expected to raise taxes, cutting public spending and scale back energy support for households. Mr Hunt will say difficult decisions are necessary to keep mortgage rates low and tackle inflation, which has soared to a 41-year high. Let's take a look through what's expected today. Well, the Chancellor will be trying to fill a black hole of around £54 billion in government finances. It's understood that will involve £30 billion in spending cuts, but the NHS is expected to get more money, with the education budget also likely to be protected, we're told. The other £24 billion will come from tax rises, mainly targeting the richest, though the Chancellor admitted at the weekend that everyone will be paying more tax. And the cap on the amount a typical household pays in energy bills will rise to £3,000 from next April. Sky News understands additional payments will be given to pensioners and low-income households. Our deputy political editor, that's Sam Coates, of course, looks at how deeply the impact of today's announcement will be felt.
It was a lot, I know, so we're going to recap.
Their parents knew the impact of rising prices. Now these children are having to learn too. At Copthall School in Barnet, 40% of the students are eligible for free school meals. It's part of an education system and a community that's feeling the strain. These teenagers are already well aware of that struggle.
People just look at us like we're children. They don't understand that we have an understanding of what's going on around us.
It has impacted us as students, majorly.
It's quite aggravating because our generation isn't seen as a strong generation. We're kind of overlooked.
More or less a decade of spending squeezes has already meant years of difficult decisions and meagre pay rises. This senior teacher says there's no more left to cut.
It's completely unsustainable. So we're already in a tight situation, but moving forward there's going to have to be very creative decisions on what we do next. That's likely to mean larger class sizes, cuts in some curriculum areas.
6-7 years more of squeeze. How does it actually make you feel?
It makes me question whether I will be able to maintain that sort of resilience.
Warnings like that are why school budgets will dodge the worst of the squeeze to come, but plenty of pain elsewhere.
So much of the focus of Jeremy Hunt's autumn statement will be on the challenging tax rises to fill the black hole. But arguably the bigger story here will be the announcement of years more squeeze on public spending, lasting most of the rest of this decade. Local councils, social services, investment in transport, all facing more pain off the back of all the austerity of the last decade.
This is the third big economic statement this year by the fourth Chancellor of 2022. Will this one set a course we stick with? Sam Coates, Sky News.
Thrilled to have Gurpreet with us this morning, new addition to our team. Good morning, great to see you. What are we expecting? We heard a little bit there from Sam.
Yeah, so the Chancellor is going to be administering pretty painful medicine today, and it's to combat two ills: higher inflation, and as a result of that, higher interest rates. They've been wreaking havoc on the economy. Very few people will have failed to notice that. And the OBR will be laying all of this bare today. That's the Office for Budget Responsibility. It's the UK's fiscal watchdog. It will be showing how far these have led to a deterioration in the public finances.
So they're basically the people that mark his homework, aren't they?
Yeah, and they were set up after the financial crisis because the Treasury was criticised for essentially putting out flattering forecasts.
OK.
So it's about providing an independent set of forecasts. And the government sets its policy decisions against those forecasts. So we think that OBR today is going to say that in order for the government to meet its fiscal target, Jeremy Hunt will tell us what that is, but we think that it's for debt to be falling as a proportion of GDP within 5 years, that it will need to find £55 billion of savings. That means tax rises and it means public spending cuts.
OK. We saw a budget, didn't we, a mini-budget at the end of September. That was a disaster, and the markets let us know about that very quickly. I'm guessing they'll react quite quickly as well, one way or the other, to this one from our present Chancellor.
Yeah, and And one of the reasons that we've got these fiscal targets, one of the reasons that Jeremy Hunt is doing this, is because he's trying to reassure the markets, he's trying to reassure them that the UK is a credible place for investors to invest, essentially. And we saw after that disastrous mini-budget what happens when investors lose confidence in the UK economy. Government borrowing costs, they went through the roof. And there's a real risk here, but it's all about striking a balance because we're already in recession, probably, and household incomes are being massively squeezed. Some are arguing that Jeremy Hunt risks going too far in an effort to overcompensate at a time when it's already pretty painful for us. But if he doesn't do any of this, then markets may not trust him, may not believe that he's actually going to do the things that he says he's going to do, and that will lead us into a whole new set of problems.
Oh, I understand. Thanks very much indeed for explaining that to us, Gurpreet. Thank you with us throughout the morning here on the programme. Dan's joining us as well. Hi, Dan. Good morning to you. You're talking to people who are, I'm sure, anxious about what the Chancellor might be saying about 11:30.
Yeah, up and down the country, there are businesses and there are members of the public, all of us, who will be watching the Chancellor to see how they are going to be impacted. We are at the Windmill Hill City Farm, right in the centre of Bristol. As you can see, there's a cafe, there's a farm shop. They're just preparing now to open. But it's a business that's had to diversify over the last few years. They also have a children's nursery. They do a lot of school trips, a lot of outreach work. And they, like all businesses, have been impacted by the cost of living crisis over the last year or so. We can have a chat to the Chief Executive, Steve Sayers, of Windmill Hill City Farm. Thanks for letting us in early as you're setting up here. Just before we come on to what you want from Jeremy Hunt in this autumn statement, tell us how you're impacted, because I hear that your energy costs alone have tripled.
Yeah, we expecting the energy bills to go up by about 3 times. We were paying £20,000 2 years ago, and it's now going to be £58,000 this year. So it's pretty steep. But beyond that, really, the cost of staff is the big thing for us. You know, we're a real living wage employer. We want to do well by our staff, and that rate has gone up by 10% this year.
We've seen inflation yesterday at that 40-year high, 11.1%. How does that, away from the staff and obviously having to pay them a living wage, that impacts your businesses in terms of the things in this cafe, for instance?
Absolutely. We are seeing prices in the cafe go up every single day. And, of course, there's a lag how quickly you can put prices up to customers and what they will actually come in and spend their money on. So we've seen the basket price drop. So, you know, 12 months ago, £8 was a typical spend in the cafe. It's down to about £6.50. People share a piece of cake rather than having one each.
Very quickly, Steve, what are you looking for from the Chancellor? What do you want? What's your top demand?
Really, some investment. So, 1, into early years as a sector that has been desperately underfunded for years, and then 2, into community buildings, in energy efficiency, so we can improve the way the building operates.
OK, Steve, I'll let you carry on setting up. The cafe opens in a couple of hours. Investment is what Steve wants at this business. I don't know whether that's going to be the top line in the Chancellor's statement. Spending cuts, tax rises may more be the thing that we're going to hear about today. We'll be speaking to people in the cafe, parents dropping off their kids at the nursery in the next hour or so to get a full spectrum of how people are feeling and what they want from Jeremy Hunt later this morning.
OK, Dan, thanks. And from 11, we'll have a special programme ahead of the autumn statement right here on Sky News. The Chancellor expected to address the Commons around about 11:30. That special programme from 11. Quick look at the papers for you. Well, the Metro headline, here we go. Grin and bear it. That's ahead of Jeremy Hunt's autumn statement, where he will raise taxes and cut spending. The Guardian reporting that Jeremy Hunt may lift the price cap on energy bills affecting millions of households. The Mirror covers a speech by the head of MI5 yesterday saying there have been at least 10 plots by Iran to kidnap or murder Brits on UK soil in the last year. Talking about that in more detail with Britain's former top spy on the show. And the Daily Mail focusing on the rationing of eggs. And that's no joke, in supermarkets amid the bird flu outbreak and the war in Ukraine. I know, I think I'm funny, nobody else does. Still to come on the programme for you, we'll speak to Britain's former top spy, as I said. That's Sir John Sawyers, as the head of MI5 reveals new details about attempts by Iran to target individuals in the UK. 7:30, joined by former Boris Johnson advisor Alex Crowley to talk about the investigation into Dominic Raab's conduct amid bullying allegations. And just before 8, the Lib Dems Treasury spokesperson Sarah Olney will be here ahead of the Chancellor's autumn statement. And the shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury, that's Pat McFadden, He's also going to be with us after 8. A new study shows new mums in Britain are 3 times as likely to die than those in Norway or Denmark. How can that be? Shaman is standing by for us this morning at the Department of Health. Hi, Shaman, good morning to you. Goodness me, tell us more about these figures.
Yeah, they are concerning figures, aren't they? Well, this research was carried out by international researchers, and they looked at mortality and maternity rates across 8 different European countries. And it found that in the UK, it had the second highest mortality rate, with 1 in 10,000 mothers dying within 6 weeks of giving birth. And it only came second, slightly less than Slovakia in that study. So it found that across all nations, that mothers were at higher risk if they were younger mothers or older mothers, and it found that the main causes were heart disease and suicide, which is really concerning, considering that the latter, with the right mental health support, could potentially be avoided. So it found that in the UK as well, that blood clots were also a leading cause when it came to new mothers as well. And this data comes after data that was published at the start of November by Embrace. So Embrace are an organisation which tracks health in mothers and in babies, and that found that there had been an increase of nearly 20% of maternal mortality cases. And they found also that women living in the most deprived areas were more than twice as likely to die than those living in the most affluent parts of the UK. Now, a Department of Health spokesperson has said that they have already invested around £127 million into the maternity system to boost the workforce and to improve care. But if there's one thing that we know is that it's not really something that you can just throw money at. There's going to be a lot of work needed to try and improve these cases, because we're already hearing today, aren't we, from a report by the National Audit Office that has found that the NHS is already under considerable pressure, and that word inflation has come around again, as they said that the money that has been put into trying to clear up some of these NHS backlogs has been chipped away by the rising inflation.
OK, for now, thank you. National Audit Office excuse me, has warned the NHS's plan to cut long waits for treatment by 2025. Excuse me. There we go. Is at serious risk because funding hasn't kept pace with inflation. The elective care waiting list has continued to increase, reaching 7 million patients in August of 2022. This includes 387,000 patients who've already waited longer than a year for treatment, compared with just 1,600 in February of 2020. Found cancer referrals have increased, but life-saving treatment is being delayed. In the year to the end of August, only 62% of patients started cancer treatment within 62 days, compared with 78% in the previous year.
There are definitely things the NHS can do to improve the situation. It can improve its own central management of the recovery plan. It can look carefully at all of the ways it can fill staffing gaps. This is very important. There's 17,500 staffing gaps in the NHS earlier this year, and that was higher than before the pandemic. And it can also look at what it can do to improve staff morale and well-being, so that people are more willing to do overtime and extra shifts again.
I want to tell you about the Chinese President Xi Jinping. He's chastised Justin Trudeau at the G20 summit yesterday in Bali, accusing the Canadian Prime Minister of leaking details of their meeting to the media. Take a listen.
Everything we discuss is then leaked to the paper. That's not appropriate. And that's not how the conversation was conducted. If there is sincerity on your part,
free and open and frank dialogue, and that is what we will continue to have. We will continue to look to work constructively together, but there will be things we will disagree on, and we will have to continue.
Let's create the conditions first.
Eek. Let's speak to Helen Ann, should we? He wasn't very happy, was he, Helen Ann? Good morning.
Good morning. No, not very happy at all. And it's worth saying this is really highly unusual to see something like this, diplomatically more broadly, but certainly for President Xi of China. It's hard to overstate just how carefully managed, how closely choreographed all of his public appearances are. And in that clip, as you can see, he's really quite agitated and really quite angry. Worth saying, I think this almost certainly will not have happened by accident, because, as I say, it's very, very unusual, almost unheard of for things to be done sort of off the cuff for President Xi. But I think it is, quite embarrassing for President Trudeau. Worth saying that the meeting between the two men was actually not a scheduled part of each of their schedules. It happened quite a brief, reasonably spontaneous meeting, apparently as part of another event. So there is a chance that the Chinese anger about this was perhaps because they didn't get a chance to prepare their response. Canadian media did write up, quoting Mr. Trudeau's offers afterwards, that they had discussed North Korea and Ukraine and Chinese interference in Canada. So perhaps that's part of the explanation. But a fascinating insight, I think, and a rare one into how President Xi conducts his diplomacy in that quite assertive way.
OK, just while I've got you, talk to me about what's going on in Myanmar. I remember a British diplomat being taken into custody. Am I right in saying that she's been released today?
Yeah, that's right. In Myanmar, it appears that 6,000 prisoners are set to be released by the military junta there. They say it's to mark Myanmar's National Day. And amongst that 6,000 are 4 foreigners. And one of those, a lady, Vicky Bowman, she's actually the former British ambassador to Myanmar. She was ambassador there between 2002 and 2006, and she's been running a not-for-profit there ever since. And she was arrested alongside her husband, who's a Myanmar national and an artist and a human rights campaigner, in the summer. The charges they were charged with at the time was about breaking immigration laws, about them not having properly registered where they live. But much understanding there and around the globe was actually it was more politically motivated than that. So she's been detained since August there, and she's been released, as I said, alongside a Japanese national, an American and an Australian as well. Myanmar obviously has been under the ruling junta after military junta after a coup that took place there in February last year, and there's been a long period of turmoil, lots of protests, violently put down at times. Over 2,000 people expected to have died, predicted to have died in that time there. So interesting indeed that this British ex-diplomat has been released.
OK, for now, thank you. We've been telling you there about Vicky Bowman, haven't we, who's a British diplomat who, living in Myanmar, has now been released. Meantime, a man in the US, in the state of Wisconsin, actually, he's been sentenced to 762 years in prison for driving into a Christmas parade last year. 6 people, including an 8-year-old boy, were killed when Darrell Brooks Jr. drove his SUV into the parade in Milwaukee after getting into a fight with his ex-girlfriend. The judge became emotional when delivering the ruling.
It's hard not to think about what I watched and not have this reaction. Those were images that frankly kept me up at night, that I saw over and over and over.
Also making news, a 14-year-old has died following a suspected stabbing in Newcastle. Gordon Galt was taken to hospital following an altercation in the Ellswick area last Wednesday, but sadly died 6 days after the incident. Local police have made 14 arrests as part of their ongoing investigation. The US and its Western allies have clashed with Russia at the UN Security Council over responsibility for a deadly missile strike in Poland.
While we still don't know all the facts, we do know one thing. This tragedy would never have happened but for Russia's needless invasion of Ukraine and its recent missile assaults against Ukraine's civilian infrastructure.
It was Ukrainian missiles that crossed into Polish territory, launched by Ukrainian air defense systems. That means that this is not just an intentional attempt of disinformation, but a conscious attempt to involve NATO, which is conducting a proxy war with Russia in Ukraine, to involve it into direct conflict with our country.
We should be clear that this is a tragedy that indisputably stems from Russia's illegal and unjustified invasion and its inhumane assault on civilians across Ukraine.
What a mockery of peace efforts that terrorists are still at the table on an equal footing with 14 members of the Security Council. One day after the gravest attack on Ukraine's critical infrastructure.
Well, NATO's chief and Poland's president have said there's no indication it was a deliberate attack and was likely a rocket launch by Ukraine, fending off Russian missiles and drones. In his nightly address, the president says his country is being transparent.
One of the main issues at the UN Security Council is the situation in Poland, clarifying all the circumstances of how Russian aggression crossed the Polish border. The Ukrainian position is very transparent. We strive to establish all the details, every fact.
Well, Siobhan standing by for us now on the Polish-Ukraine border. Hello to you, Siobhan. Looks like it was a terrible accident.
Yes, if you have a look behind me, just on the ridge of that hill there is where this investigation is focusing. That's one of the grain stores where this missile hit, killing 2 people. And it was such a tense moment when that happened earlier this week. Real concerns that this possibly had been fired by Russia, the first time that a missile has hit Poland since the war in Ukraine broke out. But these provisional findings from the Polish, from NATO, from the US, suggesting actually this wasn't fired from Russia. In fact, it was linked to Ukrainian air defences. But interestingly, this isn't an open and shut conversation. You heard there President Zelensky is challenging that intelligence at the moment. He's insisting this wasn't Ukraine's missile, this was not Ukraine's missile strike. And he's asking for access to the investigation that's going on here. Now, that's being run by the US and Poland. We're not sure if that access is going to be granted, but it's a real reminder here that this war, which the Ukrainians have been living through for months, is so close to everyone and it's so easy for it to spill over.
OK, for now, thank you. See the weather starting to change there on the Ukraine-Poland border, and that is very much going to impact on the war between Russia and Ukraine. Talking about that to come later in the programme. Meantime, let's tell you about the Brentford striker Ivan Toney, who missed out on England's World Cup squad. He's been charged with breaching FA betting rules 232 times. Let's get more now, should we, from Rob, who is in Doha for us this morning. Hello to you, Rob. We were expecting him to be in the squad, weren't we? Now I think we probably know why he wasn't.
Yeah, there's been quite a clamour for Ivan Toney to be included in Gareth Southgate's squad, particularly after he scored twice for Brentford in a victory over Manchester City last weekend. 11 goals for him this season. But we discovered a few weeks ago that he was under this FA investigation for breaching betting rules. All players are banned from any form of football, whether directly or indirectly, anywhere in the world. And this would indicate now, with the charges coming, why Ivan Toney was not selected by Gareth Southgate, and the fact he'd only been called up once by him in September and never played. Well, these charges relate to a 4-year period between 2017 and 2021, when he was at Newcastle, Brentford, other clubs, and before joining Brentford, he helped Brentford gain promotion to the Premier League for the first time, and those goals really impressing. But now he's facing potentially a ban from the game. One member of actually the England squad, Kieran Trippier, was banned himself last year for 10 weeks for breaching betting rules, for telling a friend to perhaps bet on his transfer. So these are serious charges that Ivan Toney is facing from the FA, and they will take some time to resolve. Of course, the World Cup being here in Qatar in mid-season, very unusually, means the Premier League does not resume until December the 26th on Boxing Day, so there is some time before Brentford do play again. And Brentford do say they are in contact with Toney. Toney himself has only said in recent weeks, when the news first leaked, that he's in contact assisting the FA with their investigations. Meanwhile, here in Doha, another day of training today for England and Wales ahead of their World Cup openers on Monday. England playing Iran, Wales playing the United States in their first games.
Yeah, and a bit of a clash between the security services and the media, I believe.
yeah, this is not a country perhaps used to media roaming around the streets freely, but because there's a FIFA tournament in town, we do have the freedom to report around. And a Danish TV crew the other night was out and about doing a live broadcast, and they were approached by security officials demanding to see their permits. There was an interchange on air which led to them trying to be taken off air while broadcasting, and later the Qatari authorities, the Supreme Committee in charge of this World Cup, did issue fairly quick apology saying that they should not have been disrupted in their broadcast. But what it is a reminder of is this country is very small. The local population is only about 350,000. There's a million or so more migrant workers, but they're not used to this sort of focus. They're not used to media around and filming freely, and it will take challenges for the messaging to get through to all police, all security officials, to let the likes of us report across the country. But the Qatari authorities certainly didn't want this to happen from this one police officer.
OK, for now, thank you. Obviously, we'll be covering that story for you here on Sky News in more detail. Meantime, we're hearing that children will face an increased risk of domestic abuse during the World Cup, according to the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, the NSPCC. The charity said emotional stress, alcohol and betting on matches could act as potential triggers for the incidents in the home over the next 4 weeks. Homer has been named Cambridge Dictionary's Word of the Year after it caused outrage among users of the hit game Wordle back in May. It's an informal word for a home run in baseball, but it's barely known outside the US, ruining many users' winning streaks when it was Wordle's chosen word of the day. You see, I was really irritated when they went with mummy. Mummy, I mean, how could you possibly guess mummy? They did nymph as well, didn't they? Didn't like nymph either. Now, thousands of minks are on the loose in the US state of Ohio. Have a look. Oh, I thought they were bigger than that. They're not. The swarm happened after vandals broke into a breeding farm, destroying fencing and cages. The suspects were thought to have released up to 40,000 of the animals. Officials, don't currently know if the incident was intentional. The Met Office has issued yellow weather warnings across the UK, with forecasters calling conditions atrocious. Here we go. Emergency services in West Sussex said 20 cars stuck in floodwater and motorists are likely to face heavy delays. The King sent a message of support to Australia as widespread flooding continues there to hit the east of the country. Thousands have been evacuated in large parts of New South Wales, Victoria and also the island of Tasmania as it battled its fourth major flood event so far this year. Our weather here.
Anticipation is rising, and so is the atmosphere. Are you ready? The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
It's bucketing down in London. Don't know what it's doing where you are. Quite cool this week and windy with widespread showers or more prolonged rain.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Thought we'd look at the climate dashboard for you, given all this appalling weather. Here we go. 1.23 is what we are up to, and that is global warming since 1880. This is real-time CO2 emissions in millions of tonnes, according to the University of Oxford. Over here, this is what our power mix is looking like. No coal, again, which is good news as far as our other fossil fuels are concerned. We do have some. But renewables, more than half of what we're doing at the moment are renewables, things like wind, of course, and solar. Not much solar today, though, especially because it's still dark. Hi, everybody. How are you all doing this morning? It's bucketing down outside, I'm afraid. And is there a storm coming with our Chancellor Budget Day? Jeremy Hunt will promise a plan to weather an economic storm by raising taxes, cutting public spending and scaling back energy support for households when he delivers the long-awaited autumn statement, the budget, in the Commons later on this morning, around about 11:30. Torsten Bell is director of the Resolution Foundation and he is with us now. Hello to you, Torsten. It's great to see you. Thanks for joining us on the programme. What would you expect from the budget?
Well, good morning, Kate. I think we're going to get some pretty bad economic news for the Office for Budget Responsibility, not just bad news on the likes of energy bills and high inflation, but the economy growing very slowly, possibly ending this parliament as weak as it began, it's much weaker than we were previously expecting, and actually unemployment to rise, which is the opposite of what we've been seeing in the recent past. So pretty grim economic outlook in the face of that, being told that, yes, you'll get some energy support in the short term, but in the longer term, it's tax rises and spending cuts.
What does that mean for many people who are basically on the brink of not being able to pay their mortgages?
Well, on the tax rises will probably be largely takeaways from middle and richer households, because those are the people that bear most of the burden of income taxes and capital gains taxes, which are the ones that are likely to increase. But obviously reductions in public services that those on lower incomes rely on most. Everyone relies on them, but those on lower incomes rely on them most, will be felt most at the bottom. And obviously rising energy bills, and in particular, if you look at what's happening to food prices right now, energy and food, obviously key essentials we all need to buy. They make up a bigger basket of consumption for lower income households, and it's those households who are seeing the highest inflation rate right now and finding the cost of living crisis the hardest to deal with.
And what's your view on the energy bill help that had been promised by a previous Chancellor? It looks as though that is, perhaps going to change significantly.
Well, we'll see what the Chancellor says later this morning, but I think what we're going to get is a combination of a repeat of the direct payments to vulnerable households, pensioners, those with a disability and those on lower incomes that Rishi Sunak announced back in May. That will get repeated for another year. And then on top of that, they'll keep Liz Truss's energy price guarantee, but have it at a higher level. So allow energy bills to rise, the average energy bill to around £3,000 rather than the current £2,500 level. That will be for everybody. Remember, £3,000 compares to an average energy bill before this crisis of around £1,100. So these are really big increases. And then, as I say, targeted help for some households. Those that do receive that help will get, significant amounts, maybe £1,000 support, but obviously lots won't, including actually some of the poorest households, because remember, 4 in 10 of the poorest households aren't on means-tested benefits and they won't receive those targeted payments.
What do you want them to say about pensions? I mean, when we think about pensioners, we think about some that, are struggling to heat their home, living in just one room, but not all pensioners are like that.
No, I mean, pensioners, like everybody, have a big variety. Inequality of income amongst pensioners has been rising significantly over recent decades as a richer boomer cohort ages into and towards retirement. So you do have a very big diversity. The good news is that average pensioner incomes have been growing and actually catching up with the rest of the population over the course of the last few decades. The typical pensioner is now about the same income as the typical working age household, despite having lower costs. But then the bad news is, because pensioners in lots of cases are now homeowners and tend to have larger homes than younger households these days, particularly per person, their houses are actually harder to heat. They're often less energy efficient homes too. So the direct effect of energy bills on pensioners is also worse for them than it is for lots of other younger populations. But overall, there's been good news on the pensioner front in recent decades.
Talk to me about what Andrew Bailey said yesterday, Governor of the Bank of England. He said the UK is in a far worse position than the EU and the US after COVID.
Well, I mean, he was specifically talking about what's happened to our GDP, the size of our economy since the pandemic. And he's right to say that we're the only economy in the G7 that hasn't recovered to the size it was before the pandemic struck. And that should be a really serious worry, particularly because it comes on the back of quite slow growth before the pandemic. Remember, no business investment growth since 2016 and low wage growth even going back until the financial crisis. Remember, we went into the pandemic with the same level of wages we had going into the financial crisis. So this really has been a terrible 15 years almost of economic performance for the country. Some bright spots like on employment, but overall on GDP, on productivity, on our wages, it's been a disaster.
OK, great to see you. Thanks for taking the time.
Thanks, Kate.
See ya. Dominic Raab says he's confident that he has behaved professionally while Deputy Prime Minister, despite him facing an investigation into claims he bullied members of his team.
I received notification this morning. I immediately asked the Prime Minister to set up an independent inquiry into them. I'm confident I behaved professionally throughout, but of course I will engage thoroughly and look forward, Mr. Speaker, may I say, look forward to transparently addressing any claims that have been made.
Alex Crowley is a former government advisor and he is with us now. Hi, Alex, good to see you. What is the right thing to do under these circumstances?
The right thing to do is exactly what Dominic Raab has done. As soon as a formal complaint was made, and of course in the run-up to yesterday, all we had was rumours and gossip and anonymous briefings to newspapers. As soon as that entered the system, as it were, he's done exactly the right thing and referred himself to an independent investigation to establish what the claims actually are and whether they have any merit.
So how is this different to what happened with Sir Gavin Williamson, who, you know, he was in a similar position and then he resigned a couple of days later?
Well, it was slightly different in that with Gavin Williamson, it wasn't entirely a civil service matter. It was more a matter of between him and other parliamentary colleagues. And of course, with Gavin Williamson, we did, unfortunately, have a much greater understanding of what the claims actually were. And people were able to make a judgment. And crucially, of course, Rishi Sunak, as PM, was able to make an informed judgment about that. And then clearly, Gavin Williamson walked before he was probably inevitably pushed. With Dominic Raab, all we've got is a sort of vague sense that he might have said something to someone, but that we don't actually have any details.
Well, we don't know what the details are, but of course the complaint has been made now, so somebody will. David Davis telling me, I'm sure you worked with him in your time in government, that Mr. Raab is a tough character, but not a bully. What do you think?
I think that's a fair assessment. I think if you talk to anyone who has worked with him directly or with people who have worked with him, they will tell you the same thing. Yes, he is robust. Yes, he is direct. Does that amount to bullying? I don't personally think so. I don't know what these specific allegations are, but I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing to have a minister who wants to drive delivery and who wants to do so in a very direct manner. That general attitude is probably something we could do a little bit more of.
So has the attitude, in your opinion, changed in Westminster over the last few years?
The attitude towards what, sorry?
To the attitude towards dealing with members of staff and also colleagues.
Well, I don't know. I think you get different characters in politics. So, some of them are very, very direct. Others are more passive. Each minister, each MP has their own style. Look, Westminster is or can be a very tricky place to work because the pressures are huge and also the stakes are huge. You know, particularly in ministerial office, you're dealing with very, very big decisions that really, really impact people's lives. You spoke just now about the economic impact on lower income families of the forthcoming budget. These are the stakes. So yes, you're going to have situations where people are going to be very direct with each other.
How would you describe Boris?
How long you got? The thing I can say about him succinctly is that he is not a manager. I don't think anyone ever claimed he was. He is someone that his method of driving delivery is he wants people to impress him. Because he has that sort of stardust about him, the people who work for and around him, they want his approval, and therefore they extend themselves, and they think that if they do a really good job, they'll get a bit of that kind of Boris charm and approval coming their way. That's his style, and of course other politicians have other different styles as well. But he wants to give something. He wants to give people something to live up to.
Could his approach be described as direct, and some might want to interpret that as bullying?
I don't think so. I think he certainly tells you what he thinks. If you give him an idea that is weak or an idea that he doesn't agree with, he is going to challenge that. But that's absolutely right. The last thing you want is as a political leader to sit there and sort of nod along and not really offer an opinion. That doesn't really move things forward. I certainly wouldn't characterise anything, certainly in my experience, I wouldn't characterise Boris's style in that way at all. And of course, famously, he doesn't really like confrontation. So, again, it's a very different style.
Okay. It's good to talk to you. Thanks for the insight. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Tamara is at Downing Street for us this morning, waiting to hear from the Chancellor around about 11:30 or thereabouts. Tamara, I don't think the Chancellor could ever be described as bullying or direct.
Well, Jeremy Hunt will stand up at the dispatch box today and say that we need to face into the storm, and it's the right weather for that here in Downing Street today. He'll say there are difficult decisions to be made, tax rises and spending cuts over the coming years in order to tackle what he says is the key enemy, and that is inflation, which is eroding people's wages, eroding people's savings, and making everything that we need, essentials for day-to-day life, more expensive. So what can we expect him to set out today? Well, a lot of it we know in advance, because one of the key issues for the Chancellor and the Prime Minister, who touched down from Bali this morning, is that they didn't want any big surprises like Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng. They wanted people to be prepared for it. So we can expect what we can call stealth tax rises, so people who aren't currently paying the 20p or 40p or 45p rates of tax to be dragged into them over the coming years, to be paying a little bit more every year, and for the next 5 years or so that the government can try and make up some of this shortfall. We also expect some very difficult decisions on spending cuts. Around £30 billion of spending cuts will be announced today, not all of them to happen immediately. We expect some level of protection for the NHS, but other departments, whether it's schools, local councils, the justice system, are going to, after already a decade of austerity, have to make more difficult decisions. Some Conservative MPs are a bit nervy about all of this, particularly the tax rises, given the pain people are already facing on their energy bills over the coming months and years. And how this lands, whether it actually works in salvaging the economic picture, is really crucial to whether the Conservatives can recover in the polls. The Prime Minister knows that the decision he makes today are going to be crucial to his future.
OK, lovely, thank you. Alongside his statement, Jeremy Hunt will also publish the findings of independent economic forecasts. It's those gloomy predictions that are driving many of the swinging spending cuts and tax rises that he'll be laying out. Our data and economics editor, Ed Conway, looks at the scale of the challenge facing the Chancellor.
What can we look out for? Well, first of all, there's the state of the economy, the update we get from the Office for Budget Responsibility on how we're doing. And starting with gross domestic product, these numbers are likely, the higher they are, the faster we're growing. They're likely to be revised down, of course, given that the UK is facing a recession at the moment. And when it comes to inflation, obviously, we just had those latest data on inflation. Those bars might well go up. It's just underlining what we're facing here in the country, as is this. This is a chart that they showed last time around, back in March. And it's pretty striking. The higher these bars are, the better we're doing, the bigger our household disposable income increase each year. And you can see most years it's going up, so anything above the line. But last time around, look at what happened to their forecast. Look at that bar there, down at the lowest level, the biggest fall we've seen on record. And the big question now is, will that get worse? We'll have to wait and see. But it's not just about those numbers, about the economy, about our pockets. It's also about the public finances and about talk of a black hole. What do we mean by black hole? Well, it comes back to this. This is the national debt, OK? And this is what was expected last time around, for it to be gradually falling. But then, of course, came the mini-budget. And look at this. Rather than falling, it started to rise. Those are those kind of unsustainable increases in the public finances, in the national debt that Kwasi Kwarteng introduced. And what's the black hole? It's basically about eliminating all of that, getting it down so it's falling again over the next 5 years. And that could well cost £50, £60 billion, according to the government. So we'll have to wait and see precisely what that means. Does it mean a new era of austerity? And on top of that, of course, we will be watching out for things like this. Bond yields, what's happening in the market reaction. Of course, last time around, that was the big story. Will it be this time? We'll have to wait and see.
Not too long to wait now, though. 11:30 thereabouts, we're going to be hearing from the Chancellor when he gets to his feet in the House of Commons. What will the Lib Dems make of it? Sarah Olney, Treasury spokesperson for the Lib Dems, is with us. Good morning, good morning. Thanks for joining us. What do you want to hear?
Well, I think there's several very important things we want to hear. We want to hear that pensions and benefits are going to be uprated in line with inflation. We think that's essential to protect the poorest from the worst impact of the cost of living crisis. We want to see health and education budgets increased in real terms. And the real terms is really important because we know from yesterday that inflation has gone up now to 11.1%, which is one of the highest rates on record. So it's really, really important that we continue to manage our waiting lists in the healthcare sector, and also to make sure that we are protecting our young people and our children and supporting their learning. But I think what's really disappointing, what's really dismaying, and I think what a lot of your viewers will be really unhappy about, is that every single person in this country, every single taxpayer, is going to see an increase in their taxes to pay for this government's atrocious mishandling of the economy. We know from the Resolution Foundation, for example, that £10 billion worth of extra borrowing costs is as a direct result of the interest rate hike we saw as a result of the mini budget in September. And so this black hole, which is really a blue hole, it's a creation of this Tory government, and that's what the tax increases are going to have to pay for. It's a cost to everyday taxpayers of the Conservatives' mishandling of the economy.
Yeah, but now it's those who can most afford to pay it that are going to be expected to pay, very different to what we saw in September.
I don't think that's true. I think absolutely everybody is going to find their taxes increased. What we're hearing is a freezing of the personal allowance and a freezing of thresholds. And we know that most workers are going to receive somewhere between a 5 and 8% increase in their pay this year. And of course, that's below inflation. So it's a cut in real terms. But for many people, that will be enough to pull them into either paying tax for the first time or pull them into that higher 40% tax rate band. So not only are they getting a pay cut in real terms, they are also paying more of their take-home pay in tax.
Yeah, but if you want the triple lock to stay in place, if you want 10% or 11% in line with inflation rises for those that need credits from the government, if you want the NHS to be ring-fenced and get more money, if you want more money for the Department of Education, where's it going to come from unless it's from more taxes?
Well, the Liberal Democrats have been calling for over a year for a windfall tax on oil and gas companies.
That's going to happen too.
Well, but we were calling for it back in October last year, and if it had been levied at that time, we estimate we could have raised 60 billion over 3 years to pay for public services.
Different Chancellor. We've got a different Chancellor.
Oh, we've had 4 different Chancellors. I've only been the Treasury spokesperson since July, and there have been 4 different Chancellors since then. And, you know, this constant changing of faces at number 10 and number 11 is fueling some of the political instability, which is making the financial market to react so badly.
I'm just looking at the pound, it's $1.19. I mean, it was $1.03 not too long ago. This Chancellor seems to be making a difference, no?
Well, it's partly in anticipation of what he's going to say today. But I think what I was saying is the Liberal Democrats would have imposed a windfall tax. We would have done it much earlier. We would have done it on the excess profits that the oil and gas companies have been making as a result of wholesale gas prices going up as a direct result of Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine. And what we saw when the government finally adopted our suggestion and implemented a windfall tax is that they've created an offset. They've allowed oil and gas companies to offset their investment in more oil and gas drilling. So Shell, we know, reported a few weeks ago billions of pounds worth of profit and not a single penny paid in windfall tax. And that's just part of this government's incompetence. And, you know, the Liberal Democrats have been making lots of policy suggestions over the last year. The windfall tax, we were the first to propose that. And we were the first to propose an energy price guarantee for households and businesses.
OK, you're suggesting that households could face an increase of nearly £5,000 a year after the statement. Tell us where you get that figure from.
Well, it's a combination of all the different price rises. So, of course, there's the fuel increase, which even with the energy price guarantee, most households are going to see quite a substantial increase in their fuel prices. There's the food bills that are going up, and the underlying inflation on food we saw yesterday outstrips the headline inflation figure. Then, of course, there's interest rates on mortgages. And then, of course, there's the extra taxes. So all in all, that adds up to a massive extra wodge of cost, as it were, for the average household, many of whom, as I say, will not be getting real terms pay increases this year.
Which is about £100 a week, is what you're saying. It's going to cost more.
I think so, and I think many families are already seeing that. And these extra taxes that we think the Chancellor is going to announce today will be extremely difficult for many to manage, and that will see a big hit to household incomes.
Do you have anything positive to say about this Chancellor?
Well, probably he's better than the last one, but really that's quite a low bar, so...
We're expecting about 11:30, thereabouts. It'd be great to hear what you think about it once we've heard from the Chancellor. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.